How did a civilization with no concrete, no steel, and no power tools build houses that survived some of the most violent storms on Earth, while many modern buildings fail within decades? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a problem modern engineers still struggle to solve. The North Atlantic is not simply cold. It is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Here, wind does not just blow, it collides. Storm systems roll in from the open ocean with nothing to slow them down, generating sustained winds that rival hurricanes. Rain does not fall gently from above. It is driven sideways, forced into every seam, every joint, every weakness a structure dares to expose. Snow accumulates heavy and wet, pressing downward with enormous weight, while repeated freeze-thaw cycles tear materials apart from the inside. Salt saturates the air. Moisture never truly leaves the ground. Rot is not a possibility, it is a certainty. In such conditions, most wooden buildings are, by definition, temporary. Even with modern tools, treated lumber, steel fasteners, and synthetic sealants, structures fail. Foundations shift, joints weaken, walls crack, roofs collapse under loads they were never meant to bear for long. And yet, Viking houses endured. They stood through decades of storms, through generations of winters, some through centuries. Not because they were stronger, but because they were smarter. Viking builders did not attempt to overpower the environment. They understood something that modern construction often forgets: nature cannot be defeated, only negotiated with. Instead of resisting wind, they allowed movement. Instead of sealing out moisture, they redirected it. Instead of fighting decay, they designed for it. And the most shocking part is this: their greatest secret was not strength at all. It was a quiet, deliberate philosophy of adaptability, a way of building that accepted change, embraced motion, and turned the forces that destroy rigid structures into allies. That is why their houses survived. To understand Viking architecture, you must first understand what it was built against. Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and the fractured coastlines of the North Atlantic exist in a near-constant state of assault. Here, weather is not seasonal, it is perpetual. Storm systems form far out at sea and arrive fully grown, slamming into land with little warning and even less mercy. Temperature shifts happen not over months, but within hours, forcing wood and stone to expand, contract, and twist again and again. Moisture saturates the earth so completely that the ground itself never truly dries. In this environment, architecture does not forgive error. A beam placed too close to damp soil will rot from within. A joint carved without tolerance for movement will crack and fail. A roof built too rigid or too heavy will eventually collapse under snow it cannot shed. There was no margin for theoretical design or aesthetic indulgence. Viking builders did not have the luxury of trial and error. Every winter was a test, and every failure was paid for in lost heat, lost shelter, and sometimes lost lives. Architecture was not about comfort or beauty. It was survival technology in its purest form. This relentless pressure shaped a radically different mindset. Viking builders learned that resisting nature was futile. The wind always wins. The cold always returns. Water always finds a way in. Instead of opposing these forces, they learned to work alongside them. Buildings were designed to move rather than stand rigid. Materials were allowed to breathe rather than be sealed. Structures adapted, flexed, and aged instead of fighting time. This philosophy of cooperation, not domination, shaped every decision they made. From foundations to joints, from walls to roofs, Viking architecture was built to live within the environment, not stand apart from it. And that single idea changed everything. Modern imagination often reduces Viking homes to primitive huts, dark, dirty, and overcrowded spaces where people and animals barely survived side by side. This image is familiar, but it is wrong. Archaeology paints a far more complex and impressive picture. One that forces us to reconsider how advanced Viking domestic life truly was. The Viking longhouse, known as the longhouses, was not a crude shelter. It was an architectural statement shaped by intelligence, necessity, and long-term thinking. Some longhouses stretched over 80 meters in length, rivaling modern apartment buildings. They were wide enough to support enormous roof structures and tall enough to create vast interior spaces filled with light from fire and hearth glow. These halls were designed to house entire extended families. Skilled craftsmen, servants, stored food supplies, tools, and, during winter, livestock all under a single roof. This was not disorder. It was efficiency refined by survival. By concentrating life into one structure, heat could be conserved instead of wasted. Labor could be shared and coordinated. Defense became simpler. Resources were protected and monitored. Social bonds were reinforced through constant proximity, shared meals, shared labor, and shared stories told around the central hearth. The longhouse was more than a dwelling. It was a home, a workshop, a storehouse, a fortress, and a ceremonial hall all at once. Decisions were made there. Sagas were spoken there. Generations grew, aged, and died beneath the same roof beams. The building itself became a living archive of the family that inhabited it. But the true brilliance of the longhouse was not immediately visible. It did not announce itself through ornament or grandeur. Its greatest innovation lay beneath the floor and within the structure itself, beginning with how it touched the ground and how it prepared to survive the environment that tried relentlessly to destroy it. Storms were not the greatest enemy of Viking houses. Water was. In the North Atlantic world, destruction rarely comes from above. It rises silently from below. Moisture trapped in soil seeps upward, feeding rot long before a beam ever snaps under wind or snow. Viking builders understood this reality with absolute clarity. A house placed directly on damp ground was already doomed, no matter how strong its walls or how thick its roof. Their response was deceptively advanced: dry stone foundations. Large, carefully selected flat stones were laid by hand, fitted together with remarkable precision. No mortar bound them. No cement locked them in place. Instead, gravity, balance, and geometry did the work. Each stone found its position through patience and experience, creating a stable platform that could shift slightly without collapsing. The true purpose of this foundation was singular and critical to lift the wooden structure away from moisture. The sill beam, the most important beam in the entire house, rested safely above the wet earth. Elevated and exposed to airflow, it remained dry even during prolonged rains. Air moved beneath the structure, carrying moisture away before rot could take hold. This single decision dramatically extended the lifespan of the house, often by generations. But the stone foundation did far more than prevent decay. It blocked cold wind from rushing under the floor. It leveled uneven terrain and harsh landscapes. It discouraged rodents and pests from entering the living space. It anchored the house against shifting ground during seasonal freeze and thaw. Quietly, invisibly, this stone base transformed vulnerability into resilience. And in doing so, it prepared the Viking house for something truly unexpected. A structure above that would move, breathe, and endure in ways that rigid buildings never could. Most people imagine Viking houses as heavy, rigid structures, their walls bearing the crushing weight of roof and winter snow. That assumption misses the quiet brilliance of Norse engineering. Viking walls were never meant to carry the house. Instead, the true strength lived in a hidden skeleton. Drawing directly from centuries of shipbuilding, Viking carpenters perfected post and beam stave construction. Thick vertical posts formed the load-bearing frame. Between them, long wooden planks were carefully slid into carved grooves. No nails, no glue, no iron fasteners locking them in place. This was not primitive simplicity. It was deliberate design. These walls were built to move. Wood breathes. It swells with rain and fog. It shrinks under frost and dry Arctic air. A rigid wall resists these forces and cracks. Viking walls did the opposite. Like the hull of a longship riding rough seas, they flexed under pressure. They shifted by millimeters. They absorbed stress rather than breaking beneath it. When Atlantic storms slammed into the longhouse, the walls did not stand defiant. They yielded. They bent, whispered, and returned to shape. And in that motion lay survival. Because structures that refuse to move eventually fail. But structures that adapt quietly, patiently outlast the storm itself. Here is the detail that quietly changes how we understand Viking architecture. In many longhouses, The walls were never meant to hold the house upright. They didn't have to. Above them rose a hidden system of power, a massive internal frame engineered to carry everything. The roof, layered with timber, birch bark, and heavy turf, could weigh several tons once winter snow settled in. Instead of pressing that weight outward onto fragile walls, Viking builders drove it downward. Rows of towering wooden pillars ran the full length of the hall, planted deep into stone footings. Thick horizontal beams linked them together, forming a rigid spine. Above it all rested the ridge beam, the backbone of the house, quietly bearing the burden of roof, snow, and time. This internal skeleton carried the entire structure. The walls became something else entirely. They were a skin, a shield against wind, cold, and rain. They could be opened, patched, thickened with turf, or replaced altogether without threatening the life of the house itself. This separation was revolutionary. Structure inside, environment outside. It allowed Viking halls to grow longer, wider, and more adaptable than most medieval buildings in Europe. It allowed repairs without collapse, change without destruction. What looks primitive at first glance reveals something far more advanced. A modular philosophy of building designed not just to stand, but to endure. Iron was too valuable to waste on walls and beams. Viking builders understood this with brutal clarity. Metal belonged to blades, tools, and ships. Houses demanded something else. So they turned to wood and made it stronger than iron in the one place that mattered most: the joint. Instead of nails, they used wooden dowels, carved from dense hardwood, and dried until they were nearly brittle. Each peg was driven into a hole cut with extreme precision. At first, the fit was tight. Over time, it became unbreakable. Moisture changed everything. As rain, fog, and sea air crept into the structure, the dowels absorbed humidity and swelled. The joints tightened, connections locked. What would weaken iron only strengthened wood. Where metal rusted and failed, timber adapted. This was not improvisation, it was applied material science. Viking carpenters understood how wood behaves under pressure, how it breathes with the seasons, how it responds to water instead of resisting it. Wood joined to wood created a living bond, flexible, resilient, and self-reinforcing. Every storm tested the structure. Every winter made it stronger. But these pegs were only one part of a larger system, because for a house to truly survive the North Atlantic, strength alone was never enough. Viking builders spoke a language that never needed words. It was spoken through joints. Mortise and tenon connections cut so tightly they seemed grown, not built. Hidden lap joints that disappeared once assembled. Interlocking notches that trapped beams together using gravity and force. Compound joints, where multiple techniques merged into a single, intelligent solution. Nothing here relied on nails. Nothing depended on brute strength. Weight was transferred through geometry. Pressure followed carefully carved paths. Forces were redirected, shared, dispersed. When these joints came together, the house no longer behaved like separate pieces of timber. It moved as one organism, flexing, settling, breathing with the seasons. The axe was the master tool. Not a crude instrument, but a precision device in skilled hands. With it, carpenters sculpted wood to tolerances measured in millimeters, guided by an intuitive understanding of load, tension, and failure. They knew exactly where a beam would bend, exactly where stress would gather, exactly how to release it. This knowledge was never written. It was passed from hand to hand, father to son, master to apprentice, learned through repetition, observation, and survival. Mistakes were remembered. Successful joints became tradition, and that silent inheritance produced houses that could endure storms, snow, time, and neglect, structures whose intelligence still challenges modern engineering. Because when geometry replaces force, resilience becomes inevitable. Wood alone was never enough to survive a northern winter. The Vikings understood this early, so they looked downward toward the earth itself. Walls were not simply built, they were grown. Thick slabs of turf were cut directly from the land, lifted with their roots intact, and stacked layer by layer against the wooden frame. Over time, those roots intertwined, binding soil, grass, and moisture into a single mass. What emerged was not a wall, but a living barrier often more than a meter thick. Wind died inside it. Cold slowed to a crawl. Heat lingered. The earth absorbed temperature swings, holding warmth through the night and releasing it slowly through the day. Fire, the greatest fear of wooden buildings, became far less dangerous when surrounded by damp soil and grass. The roof followed the same logic. First came birch bark, naturally waterproof, layered like scales. Above it, turf was laid again. Weight pressed everything tight. Grass took root. The roof sealed itself. Snow no longer tore at the structure. Storm winds slid over it. From a distance, the house nearly vanished into the hillside. This was not architecture that challenged nature. It borrowed from it. It blended into it. The Viking house did not dominate the land. It became part of the land, and that is why it endured. Modern buildings are engineered to resist movement. Steel locks into concrete. Walls are fixed. Failure comes suddenly, without warning. Viking houses were built on a different philosophy. They were meant to move. Every element allowed controlled motion. Foundations lifted timber away from rot while letting the structure settle naturally. Joints tightened as humidity rose. Walls flexed with wind instead of cracking. Roofs grew heavier under snow, pressing the structure into stability rather than collapse. Even smoke played a role. Constant hearth fires filled the roof space, drying and preserving timbers, sealing joints with resin and soot. Moisture, instead of weakening the house, strengthened it. Weight, instead of threatening collapse, became an anchor. None of this was accidental. It was a worldview shaped by storms, winters, and survival. The Vikings understood something many modern designs forget. Systems that adapt outlive systems that resist. What cannot bend will fail, sometimes violently. What is allowed to yield survives. Their houses were not statements of dominance over nature. They were negotiated truces, quiet agreements built from wood, earth, and experience. And that may be the real secret behind their endurance. Not strength, but wisdom. The past is often dismissed as primitive, but sometimes what we call progress is simply forgetting old wisdom. The Viking house was not just a building. It was a philosophy carved in wood and earth. A reminder that survival does not belong to the strongest but to the most adaptable. If these forgotten technologies still challenge modern engineering, what else has history buried beneath the soil? Welcome to Shadows of Valhalla, where lost knowledge waits in silence, and the past still has lessons to teach those willing to listen.